2. Spread spectrum communication and code theory. On a swell-scorching summer day, René Descartes was enjoying a nap when he noticed a fly buzzing around. This simple distraction led him to pioneer a brand new field of mathematics, analytic geometry. Isaac Newton, a quintessential genius of the 17th century, discovered the laws of motion and universal gravitation. However, his greatest achievement was his use of mathematical tools to systematically organize and advance scientific thought. His methodology became the definitive model for generations of scientists to follow. As these examples show, mathematics provides the foundation for organizing our thoughts systematically and provides the logical basis for further development. In this discussion, we will explore spread spectrum communication and its resulting implications. To ensure the rationality of our conclusions, we will begin with the fundamental principles of mathematics. We tend to find meaning in the idea that nothing in this world appears in isolation, rather, everything manifests through interconnectedness. For instance, we define someone born into our family before us as an older brother or older sister. Even our favorite food is defined in contrast to the foods we dislike. Our very identity, our unique characteristics, is defined by the relationships we form within society. In this way, we assign meaning to everything around us by establishing these mutual connections. Ultimately, forming these interrelations is the fundamental way in which we perceive, understand, and contemplate the world. In this regard, identifying the interrelationships within a system is equivalent to discovering the defining characteristics that allow us to understand that system. These characteristics are defined by identifying the specific relationship between a stimulus and its corresponding response. Consider a vending machine that dispenses a cup of mixed coffee. When you insert 101, we can be certain that 101 will yield a coffee because we understand the machine's specific characteristic. It responds to an input of 101 with an output of coffee. This characteristic is the very reason for the machine's existence and its defined purpose. This is how we assign meaning to the things we perceive. Therefore, defining a system is the process of finding its characteristics, and finding those characteristics is, in itself, the act of defining the system. For this reason, we seek to identify the interresponsive characteristics, the mutual relationship between cause and effect, to understand the responses determined by various factors. Let us translate this into mathematical terms. We will denote the input, or the causal factor, as the independent variable, x. Since input values can appear randomly, or be changed freely, we refer to them as independent. Correspondingly, we view the system's interresponsive characteristics as the process of determining the dependent variable, y, which changes according to x. In this context, y represents the result, or output, and is conventionally labeled as such. Of course, an independent variable is not limited to just one. For example, the price of a bowl of jjajangmyeon is determined by numerous factors. The cost of flour, labor costs for the chef, delivery personnel, and cashier, as well as facility maintenance fees. Thus, there can be countless independent variables, factors that determine the output beyond just a single x. Defining relationships as functions in a mathematical context. Defining an interrelationship can be understood as identifying a functional relationship. A function is more than just a way to link two numbers. It is a tool used to formalize the order of the world into logical rules. The structure of a function illustrates how the dependent variable, y, changes according to the independent variables, such as x. In the language of mathematics, we express this as y if this notation states that y is a function of x. Here, the f stands for function, representing the specific rule or mechanism that transforms an input into a specific output. A function fundamentally allows us to grasp the causality and dependency between independent and dependent variables. It describes exactly how the output changes in response to the input. Defining a system through a functional relationship implies a critical rule. For every specific output, there must be a corresponding input. In other words, the appearance of a specific output proves that its corresponding input existed. Conversely, if we wish to obtain a particular result, we simply need to provide the input that corresponds to it. This realization is profound because it means we possess the power to control and predict phenomena. If we have a device that takes an input x, squares it, multiplies the result by 3, and then adds 3 to produce an output y, its interresponsive characteristic is defined as y equals 3x squared plus 3. The function describing this device's output relative to its input allows us to grasp the causality and dependency between the variables. Since every output value corresponds to a specific input, we can control the input to achieve a desired output and predict the output for any given input. So far we have only talked about how a single independent variable determines the dependent variable. However, in reality, outputs are often determined by a multitude of independent variables. Instead of a simple polynomial of x, y might be represented by polynomials of various other variables. Furthermore, the form of these functions often goes beyond simple squares. They involve roots, cube roots, trigonometric functions, as well as logarithmic and exponential functions. An example of such a complex relationship might look like this. Y equals 3 sin omega squared plus e to the x cubed minus root t. In some cases, the relationship between input and output is expressed through derivatives. This occurs when the output is determined by the rate of change of the input. This is the most common model for biological reproduction found in nature, and serves as the foundational equation for deriving the natural constant, E. And then, one of the most complex functional structures we frequently encounter is the multiple composite function, where a function is nested within another function multiple times. The most prominent example of this is the mathematical model for neural networks. Logic is the study of the laws and forms of correct reasoning, examining how valid and consistent the process of thought is to ensure it remains airtight. In academic fields such as mathematics, physics, and chemistry, logical thinking methods are utilized to ensure the validity of the inquiries that lead to one's theories or conclusions. Meanwhile, in mathematics, which can be considered the foundational science of the natural world, defining the relationship between input and output as a function provides a concrete implementation of logical thinking. This indicates that one can control the input values to obtain a specific output, or predict the output for a given input. In disciplines like physics and chemistry, the specific functional relationships of the subjects under study are explored in detail within their respective specialized fields. For instance, in physics, wave phenomena are investigated physically, and the results are organized into wave equations. This represents a process where theories explored regarding physical phenomena are formalized using mathematical tools. In conclusion, the fact that an input and output or the response to a condition or stimulus can be explained through a mathematical model, such as a functional relationship, implies that it is something we can interpret and analyze. In other words, it means we can predict what form the results will take. This is a very important concept, as it defines the scope of academic inquiry where knowledge can be explored and accumulated. Mathematical expressions must not be treated as pedantic decorations, rather, they should offer new or alternative perspectives on a core concept. Therefore, the progression of the mathematical formulas used here represents a process of logical inference, and the resulting equations are concise expressions reflecting the culmination of systematic thought. 2.1 Correlation and orthogonality. In this section, we will discuss correlation, which is treated as an essential concept in communication theory, as well as cellular mobile communications. Furthermore, we will explore orthogonality, understood as a specific characteristic of correlation between two signals, and its properties. In English, correlation is termed correlation, and orthogonality is termed orthogonal. Both correlation and orthogonality are fundamental and vital concepts in signal processing. 2.1 Correlation. The phrase like father, like son implies that a son resembles his father's appearance, lifestyle habits, or temperament. To resemble something means that specific attributes or a portion of its properties are identical. Even if a son who resembles his father is lost in a large crowd of people, he can be easily identified as his father's son because of those shared physical traits. Because they are so easily linked, this resemblance becomes the defining characteristic between the two individuals. How, then, can we measure the degree of resemblance, the degree of correlation between two entities? Let us first consider a simple comparison between the numbers 15 and 16. Intuitively, we know that 16 is greater than 15, and that the two numbers are different. But how exactly are we able to arrive at this inference? The conclusion that 16 and 15 are different, and that 16 is greater than 15 by exactly 1, can be reached through a thought experiment involving two bags. A red bag containing 16 balls, and a blue bag containing 15 balls. In this experiment, if we can pull out exactly one ball from each bag simultaneously, we can define the state of the two bags as being identical for that moment. However, if a point is reached where we can still pull a ball from one bag, but can no longer pull one from the other, the states of the two bags become different. One bag remains in a state where a ball can be retrieved, while the other is in a state of depletion, and then let's conduct an experiment comparing the states of two bags, a red bag containing 16 balls, and a blue bag containing 15 identical balls, by removing one ball at a time from each. As long as we can extract a ball from both the red and blue bags simultaneously, we define the two bags as being in the same state. However, if we can pull a ball from one bag but can no longer do so from the other, the states of the two bags are considered different. As we continue this process, we eventually reach the 16th attempt. At this point, we can still pull a ball from the red bag, but there are no balls left to extract from the blue bag. Thus, at the 16th step, the states of the two bags are different. Now, let's compare the degree of similarity, the correlation between the blue bag and the red bag. During the first 15 attempts to remove a ball, we were able to extract a ball from both bags simultaneously. Therefore, we can consider the states of the two bags to be identical up to the 15th attempt. However, at the 16th attempt, the two bags differ. In terms of correlation, we can conclude that the two bags are perfectly correlated for 15 steps, but their correlation breaks at the 16th step. In this way, we establish that 16 and 15 are indeed different. Since this divergence began after the 15th attempt, specifically at the 16th, we can conclude that 16 is exactly 1 unit greater than 15. Through this process of comparing the states of the two bags, we are able to represent sameness and difference as quantified numbers. At each attempt, if the states of the two bags are the same, meaning we can extract a ball from both, we can assign a value of 1. If the states differ, such as when one bag provides a ball while the other is empty, we assign a value of 0. By comparing the states of the two bags at every attempt, and calculating the sum or the average of these results, we can define the degree of correlation. This logic is identical to how we might assess the resemblance between a father and his children. If we examine 100 different personality traits of a father, and find that his son shares 90 of them while his daughter shares 95, we are effectively measuring their correlation to the father. In this case, with scores of 95 and 90 respectively, the daughter resembles the father more closely than the son does by a factor of 5. Consequently, the correlation between the red bag containing 16 balls and the blue bag containing 15 balls is 15/16. One might argue that after the 17th attempt, the two bags return to a same state, because neither can provide a ball. However, since we define the same state specifically as the condition where both bags contain balls, this post-depletion phase is not a state of equality, but rather a state that must be excluded from the analysis. Therefore, to measure similarity accurately, we must define the observation range as the first 16 attempts, where at least one bag remains active. The degree of correlation, which serves as a metric for the similarity between different signals or waveforms, is determined in a similar manner. Correlation is a measure of the resemblance between two signals in a time series, or the extent to which two time series can be represented as a linear function. Here, a time series means that the changing shape of a signal is manifested according to the passage or flow of time. For example, a signal that changes in a cosine shape over time is called a cosine function, or a cosine signal. A correlation function expresses the correlation between two signals in the time domain. It is broadly categorized into two types: autocorrelation and cross-correlation. The mathematical expression for correlation is defined similarly to the bag comparison discussed earlier. Before defining correlation, we must consider which algebraic operator determines whether two values are the same. The degree of similarity between value A and value B is a measure of how much of B's components are contained within A. In other words, it is the extent to which a value is simultaneously A and B. In logic, this can be determined by the AND condition between value A and value B, and the algebraic operator for this is expressed as multiplication. The correlation function, which calculates this relatedness, can be represented as shown in equation 2.1. That is, after comparing each respective value of the two functions f and g, the average of those results is calculated. Here, to compare means to multiply. However, while the two functions being compared can be discrete values, they are more commonly continuous. Therefore, the general expression of the function to find the correlation value can be rewritten as shown in equation 2.2. Meanwhile, in the case of digital signals, the truth table for correlation values is shown in figure 2.1. Here, the digital circuit operator that can generate A1 or A0, depending on whether two bits are the same or different, is the exclusive OR. Of course, it is also possible to set A1 for identity and A0 for difference, or vice versa. The degree of correlation between two signals is calculated and evaluated by the correlation function. Generally, correlation measures the degree of similarity between two different signals in the time domain. This is known as cross-correlation. On the other hand, there is also a type of correlation performed when the two signals being compared are actually the same signal, but with an offset of an arbitrary time delay. To distinguish this from cross-correlation, it is called autocorrelation. Furthermore, autocorrelation is the time domain representation of a signal's energy spectral density measured in the frequency domain. As such, it is often evaluated as a property that indicates how much a signal remains unchanged over time. Meanwhile, there are cases where there is absolutely no correlation between signals. Such a case is described as being orthogonal to each other. 2.1. To autocorrelation. One might think that autocorrelation, being a correlation between two identical signals, would always yield the exact same correlation value. However, the autocorrelation discussed here refers to the degree of similarity with oneself after a certain amount of time has passed. In other words, it measures the correlation between the present me and the me from 10 years ago, or the me 10 years in the future. This can be a deeply meaningful value. In another sense, it is also used as a metric to indicate the degree to which a signal remains unchanged over a time series. In particular, in CDMA mobile communication systems, the central theme of this book, autocorrelation properties, are treated as a critical technology for acquiring the pilot signal. Identification of the received pilot signal's PN code is achieved by calculating the correlation value between the PN code of the received signal and the PN code generated locally within the receiver. In other words, this process identifies the phase of the PN code. Thus, the receiver calculates the correlation between the received signal and the local signal to time align their received signal for demodulation. Demodulating to signals after aligning them in time like this is called coherent demodulation. The word coherent carries the meaning of sticking together, or clinging, which brings to mind the coherent demodulation method of neatly time aligning the received signal and the local signal before overlapping or, more specifically, multiplying them. However, the reason we specifically refer to this as the autocorrelation characteristic is that, although the received signal among the two signals being evaluated for correlation has undergone a phase shift while passing through the channel, the signal intended for correlation is originally the same as the signal generated by the local oscillator. In other words, the signals received by a CDMA receiver performing demodulation with a coherent demodulator are signals transmitted from the same transmitter. However, they are received with different phases because the paths those signals take through the channel are all different. Another technology in this book that utilizes autocorrelation properties is the linear prediction process of the vocoder, the voice compression technology used in mobile phones. Through the correlation between one's past self and present self, it is possible to judge how the present me has changed compared to the past me, if we have been continuously calculating the correlation of a signal that changes in the time domain. We can predict future changes through the results of those correlation calculations. This is because the current state of the signal was, at some point in the past, a future state. Therefore, from the current standpoint, the present signal state can be treated as the foundational data for predicting the future signal state. This is called linear prediction. If someone calls out a sequence of numbers arranged in a specific pattern, and suddenly stops, asking what the next number will be. We use linear prediction to provide the answer. For instance, given the sequence 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 inches, we predict that the next number will be 6 inches. On what basis do we predict that 6 is the next number? We do so by considering the underlying rule of the preceding sequence. In other words, we predict the future by analyzing the trends of the past. This is the simplest possible example of linear prediction. In this manner, the autocorrelation function can be utilized to estimate the extent to which future values can be predicted from past values, or to determine how a waveform changes relative to its current value after a time delay of t. These characteristics of autocorrelation are also used to identify the periodicity of an arbitrary function. If the autocorrelation value between a signal starting at the origin and the same signal delayed by a constant time t is identical, it suggests that the signal may be a periodic signal with a period of t. If the signal is indeed periodic, the autocorrelation will exhibit peak values at specific, regular intervals. The autocorrelation function of a signal, x, is generally denoted as Rxx, and this refers to the correlation between the signal x at time t and the signal x at time t tau. This is expressed as the average value obtained by multiplying each of the values of the signals appearing at each point in time during the signal's period t. That is, the values of the signals appearing at every point in time are multiplied by each other, and the time interval for this multiplication is the period t. Expressing this mathematically, the signals are multiplied and integrated over the interval of period t. As a result, the autocorrelation function is as shown in equation 2.3. At this time, the delay time tau can be any real number. 2.1. 3. Orthogonal. One can consider a case where, upon measuring the correlation between two signals, the result shows no correlation at all. This means that among the properties held by the two signals, there is absolutely nothing in common. This is similar to the properties of prime numbers in mathematics, which are the fundamental building blocks of all numbers. Elements in science, which are considered the basic components of all matter. And furthermore, the general meaning of elements, in other words, the property of being orthogonal, allows a signal to become an element that represents something else, serving as an axis of a coordinate system. Any arbitrary signal we know, or signals that appear complex and diverse, can be expressed as a sum of element signals that are orthogonal to each other. This is similar to how all numbers are expressed, only as products of prime numbers, which are the fundamental building blocks of numbers. In this way, each element signal possesses a constant or characteristic weight, and the sum of all those element signals represents the total signal. Here, the weight must be a simple constant that is represented by a certain element signal, and must not be a function of the element signal itself. The specific method for expressing these complex and diverse signals is the Fourier series. The Fourier series expresses a signal as a sum of element signals, including sin, which have integer multiple frequencies, orthogonal to sin and cos terms. Furthermore, as the Fourier series has been modified and developed into the Fourier transform today, it has become a very important theory in signal analysis. The Fourier transform provided an expansion of perspective, extending the characteristics of a signal into a representation in the frequency domain. Moreover, this provides the theoretical foundation for CDMA spread spectrum communication, which is the subject of this book. Figure 2 shows the representation of signals separated by their orthogonal properties. Phase shift keying modulation methods, such as QPSK modulation, represent the phase on a plane consisting of the I-axis and the Q-axis, which are orthogonal to each other. This is possible because the cosine theta axis, representing the in-phase component, and the sine theta axis, representing the quadrature component, are orthogonal. Thus, phase information can be fully represented on a phase plane defined by the values of cosine theta and sine theta. This is equivalent to being able to represent a position on an xy plane, x and y values. Furthermore, this implies that within the indicated phase information, there are no values other than sine theta and cosine theta components. It also indicates that the sine theta and cosine theta components alone are sufficient to completely represent all possible phase information that a modulated signal can possess. Orthogonality is also useful for representing the quantities we handle. For example, a red apple weighing 50 grams and costing 1001 is a quantity that expresses an apple through the attributes or weights of the elements. Weight, color, and price, if you think about it, all physical quantities we know and deal with possess various attributes. Among them, a quantity can be expressed using the attributes of orthogonal elements and their respective weights. This method also allows for a more specific representation of a physical quantity's value, since the most representative form of values expressed by each of these orthogonal elements is a vector. Values expressed in this manner are called vector values. As for the directions of movement, horizontal, vertical, and height, there are three orthogonal directions. Thus, each element of a vector representing motion is defined by the orthogonal elements I, j, and k. The most representative vector value we know is a coordinate value located on the x, y plane, that is, the coordinate 2, 3, is a value where the x component is 2, and the y component is 3. For this reason, orthogonal elements are called coordinate axes. Furthermore, in physics, coordinate axes are also referred to as dimensions. For example, what is created by three coordinate axes, the x, y, and z axes, or a value represented by these three coordinate axes, is a three-dimensional space. As a result, there can also be values expressed as vector values within dimensions, coordinates, or elements. While there are countless examples of the vector values we use in vocoders, a voice compression technology, there is the concept of a codebook, which stores the residual signals of speech as codebook vectors in a multi-dimensional format. Meanwhile, there is the orthogonality between codewords used to constitute the channels in CDMA. In traditional communications systems, channels were distinguished by dividing frequency or time ranges, such as frequency bands or time slots. However, in the case of CDMA, this is performed using orthogonal codes. Multiple channel signals that are to be multiplexed must be distinguishable by their channel identifiers, even if the signals become mixed through multiplexing. The same applies to the code channel soft CDMA. To achieve this, signals are modulated with codes that guarantee orthogonality between codewords. A representative code that guarantees orthogonality is Walsh code, which is specifically referred to as an orthogonal code.